a breath of fresh air. Because here they're saying, well, yeah, we have to articulate women as a very specific and particular aspect of national liberation that has a distinction, a specificity of its own. And I still remember, I didn't have a chance to look at it again because I don't have it, but I still remember Ida's essay. I think it's kind of a seminal, or maybe I should say Aguilar essay. The title of which was, Feminist in the US Do women really hold up half the sky? And I think you were arguing for a nationalist kind of feminism, remember? Yeah. 84, yeah. So by that time, it was okay to talk about the women's movement here in the Philippines as feminist. Mostly because of brave women like Ida and Lulu. And I think they could do it because they had the credentials for it. That is, they had suffered incarceration and all, the credentials, of the movement. Even so, I thought that the revolutionary movement's view of women was instrumental. By that I meant that they were interested in women only insofar as they could be recruited to the movement, but couldn't really pay, enough attention to gender relations. Meantime, let me tell you a little bit about feminism in the United States about that time as well. As I mentioned earlier, the women's movement, which was clearly feminist in the United States, was flourishing. The attention given by theoreticians was to the gender relations in the household and in the family. They viewed the family, and this is white middle-class feminists, they saw the family as the main arena of conflict. And later on, of course, they talked about, years later, a decade later, they talked about the glass ceiling for women. That is, that women could not really ascend up the corporate ladder, not only because of the glass ceiling, but also because of the sticky kitchen floor. So that has to do with gender in the household. In the meantime, there was also the UN Decade for Women. I don't know if any of you know about that. The years 1975 to 85 was designated as the Decade for Women, in which there were international meetings. I mention this because those meetings were important in that they marked the differences between what was then called first world and third world feminisms. Now we talk about North and South, right, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Don't talk about East and West so much anymore. So during the first couple of meetings of the Decade for Women, in particular meeting, the first one was in Mexico, and then in Copenhagen, first world feminists, in particular US women, looked at the issues that looked askance at the issues brought forth by third world women and said, these are not feminist issues. Because what they did was they talked about the basic needs like water, need for water, shelter, food, the basic necessities. Or they talked about United States support for dictatorships in their countries. And feminists in the United States, because their focus on their kind of feminism was so narrowly focused on gender, did not understand that as a gender issue, as a feminist issue. So, for example, Betty Friedan, who is seen as one of the foremothers of US feminism, had a meeting with Domitila de Chungara, the wife of a Bolivian mine worker, who was talking about, the exploitation of mine workers in Bolivia and Betty Friedan said, that's not feminism, you know. Or Palestinian women would bring, you know, their issues. And again, you know, first world feminists, in particular US women, would say, well, that's not feminism. So, you know, in short, they would not understand national liberation either, or nationalist feminism, the one that you know was then flourishing in the Philippines as a feminist position. It was not until 1985, the meeting in Nairobi, and feminists writing today marked that date as the kind of coming together of women from the East and the West, finally understanding each other's issues. That is, first world women began to recognize that economic issues were primary. Issues of poverty were primary for third world women. By the same token, third world feminists began to see, you know, the gender relations as, you know, perhaps legitimate issues. However, the problem was that even though there was this kind of recognition, the 80s also brought forth a tide of neoconservatism that has now crystallized. By neoconservatism, we mean the launching of neoliberal policies. By the way, Margaret Thatcher, was one of the first to welcome neoliberalism in the UK, you know, by privatization of social security and all of that. So the 80s has been called by some feminists as the lost decade, because the kind of understanding that was forged in the meeting, in the more salutary meeting between first and third world women, was wiped out by the loss of the gains, the rollback of the gains rather, that women had made because of structural adjustment, because of the debt crisis in particular, right? The debt burden, and the Philippines suffered greatly from that, along with Latin American countries and, you know, countries in sub-Saharan Africa. What is also curious is that about the same moment, you had a new theoretical perspectives that were welcomed at the university, because now you have a neoconservative period, right? Ushered in by Thatcher, in UK, by Reagan, the Reagan-Bush administration in the United States, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of social movements in general. Decline of that, and we need to understand that. Now, what is curious during that period is there was a change in intellectual paradigms. Among feminists in the United States, well, first of all, I should mention that second wave feminists in the United States were criticized for being inattentive to race, you know, that they were racist, in that what they did was to talk about their own experience, and to generalize this to other women, not only women of color in the United States, but also to women around the world. They assumed that, you know, their experience was universal. In response to that, around the 80s, they turned to postmodern perspectives and looked at difference. They used the paradigm of difference, which was quite liberating.